The morning flight from Dubai to Istanbul was supposed to be calm and peaceful. Families settled into their seats, business travelers opened their laptops, and the cabin crew smiled as they moved through the aisle. In seat 18A sat an 11-year-old boy with bright eyes and a quiet nature. He looked excited but nervous, holding a small notebook filled with drawings of airplanes and cockpit controls. He always dreamed of becoming a pilot one day, even though he had never touched real aircraft controls before. His mother sat beside him, telling him to relax as the plane pushed back from the gate. He nodded, but his heart was beating fast. Not from fear, but from pure love for flying. As the plane climbed into the sky, the boy kept watching every movement. The wing tips, the flaps, the sound of the engines. He knew something about everything. He spent years watching aviation videos, reading manuals, and sitting in makeshift simulators at home. Sometimes people laughed at him for being too obsessed, but he never cared. Flying was the one place where he felt alive. After cruising altitude was reached, the captain made a warm announcement. His voice was calm and confident, the kind of voice that reassured passengers they were safe. Cabin lights dimmed, and most people started relaxing. The boy stared at the small screen showing the flight path. He whispered details to himself: altitude, airspeed, heading. His mother smiled, knowing her son loved every second of it. But 1 hour into the flight, something unexpected happened. A small shake ran through the plane. It wasn't turbulence, at least not the normal kind. The seatbelt signs came on quickly. Passengers looked around. Some tightened their belts, some whispered questions, while some ignored it, thinking it was nothing. The boy, however, felt something different. The vibration was uneven, small but strange. He leaned closer to the window, listening closely. He noticed the engines sounded slightly off rhythm, not loud but not smooth either. His interest slowly turned into worry. Moments later, a flight attendant walked fast toward the cockpit, her face tense. Another attendant followed her with a medical kit. That was the moment the cabin's energy shifted. People who had been laughing now fell silent. A few passengers began staring nervously at the closed cockpit door. The boy watched everything carefully. He had never seen crew members rush like that without making an announcement first. His mother sensed his tension and asked softly if he was okay. He nodded, but inside he felt a tight knot forming. The plane shook again, this time stronger. The lights flickered for half a second. The cabin crew tried to stay calm, but their expressions told a different story. One attendant stepped forward to make an announcement, but her hands trembled slightly as she held the microphone. Before she could speak, the cabin phone rang from the cockpit. She answered, listened, and her face went pale. She whispered something to another crew member, something the boy couldn't hear, but he could read fear in her eyes. People started asking questions. Is everything okay? What's happening? Are we safe? Some tried to stand up, but attendants told them to stay seated. The tension grew thicker with every passing second. Then suddenly the cockpit door opened halfway. A crew member quickly stepped out, signaling another attendant to take over. The boy could see just a small glimpse inside. The captain was slumped in his seat, unconscious, and the first officer looked overwhelmed, trying to manage several alarms at once. The door closed quickly again, but the boy had already seen enough. He whispered to himself, barely audible, "They need help." Passengers started panicking as the plane dipped slightly. Drinks spilled. A child in the back began crying. A man shouted that the plane was losing altitude. The attendants kept trying to calm everyone, but even their voices shook. The boy felt his heart pounding faster, not from fear but from a strange sense of responsibility. He knew what those alarms meant. He knew what a sudden drop at cruising altitude could signal. He had studied emergency situations so many times, but he never imagined seeing one in real life. His mother grabbed his hand tightly. She asked him to stay calm, but the boy wasn't even thinking about himself. He was thinking about the cockpit, the alarms, the aircraft systems he had memorized through years of passion. He looked around at the frightened faces of the passengers. 236 people who just wanted to reach home safely. Suddenly the plane tilted again, more sharply this time. Gasps filled the cabin. Someone yelled that they were dropping too fast. The boy stood up slightly, looking toward the cockpit. He wanted to help, he needed to help, but he was just a child. Who would listen to him? Who would believe that he knew anything about flying? Then he remembered something. The manuals, the simulators, the endless nights practicing. He knew he wasn't a real pilot, but he also knew the plane needed someone who understood the basics until help arrived. He took a deep breath, his face pale but determined, and whispered to his mother, "I think I can help them." She stared at him, shocked, but in his eyes she didn't see fear. She saw purpose. And in that moment, everything in the boy's life began to change. The cabin crew moved quickly between passengers, trying to manage the growing panic, but it was clear they were struggling. The plane's tilt had steadied, yet the atmosphere remained heavy and tense. People whispered prayers, parents hugged their children, and the soft sound of the engines no longer felt comforting. The boy kept watching the front of the aircraft, sensing every small change in altitude and pitch like someone who had lived inside a cockpit his whole life. He knew he couldn't just walk up to the flight attendants and claim he could help. They would never believe an 11-year-old had any valuable knowledge about flying a jet. But he also knew doing nothing wasn't an option. He waited, observing the crew closely, trying to find the right moment. One attendant, the one who had answered the cockpit call earlier, was breathing fast and trembling slightly as she tried to calm a frightened elderly woman. The boy saw in her eyes that she wasn't just anxious. She was scared because she knew the situation was serious. Before he could speak to her, the intercom turned on. A shaky voice filled the cabin, not the captain's calm tone, not even the first officer's confident one. It was a crew member, trying to hide her tension. She announced that one pilot was unwell and that the other was working on stabilizing the aircraft. She told passengers to remain seated and trust the team. But even though her words were steady, the boy could hear the fear behind them. He could tell the plane still wasn't flying smoothly. It was subtle, a slight uneven drift, but he felt it clearly. The boy looked at his mother again. She could see he was thinking deeply, battling himself. She had always known he wasn't like other kids. He didn't spend hours on games or cartoons. He spent his time studying cockpit layouts, emergency procedures, and air traffic radio videos. She had once joked that he knew more about flying than some adults. Now she wondered if those countless hours actually meant something. He whispered to her again, this time with more certainty. "I can help them. They don't know me, but I know this aircraft type. I know what to do if they tell me the situation." His mother looked straight into his eyes. She didn't see a child guessing. She saw a child who had prepared his whole life for something he never imagined facing. Before she could respond, another sharp noise came from the overhead speakers, a brief alarm tone that wasn't part of normal flight sounds. People gasped. The plane slightly dipped again before leveling. The boy felt it immediately, a drop that meant the autopilot was struggling. The first officer must have been trying to manage too many things at once. His mother squeezed his hand. "If you truly think you can help, even a little, then tell the crew." Her voice trembled, but she trusted him. He stood up slowly. For a moment, he felt thousands of eyes on him, though most passengers were too distracted to notice. He took a small step into the aisle just as an attendant approached, trying to reassure people. When she saw the boy standing, she gently reminded him to sit down, but he kept his voice steady as he spoke. "Please, I need to talk to you about the cockpit." She blinked, confused. "Sweetheart, you need to stay seated. Everything is under control." He shook his head respectfully. "No, it's not. The plane is drifting. The autopilot isn't holding the correct balance. The first officer is trying alone. I understand this aircraft. I know the procedures. Please let me help him." Her face showed surprise mixed with disbelief. For a second, she assumed he was imagining things. But the boy didn't look like he was pretending. He spoke calmly with technical accuracy. Altitude, pitch, drift, stabilizer behavior. Words an ordinary child shouldn't know. The attendant's eyes widened. She suddenly remembered how the cockpit door had been briefly opened earlier. She had seen the captain unconscious. She had seen the first officer's stress. She knew they didn't have a second pilot available. And now, this small boy was standing here, speaking like someone who understood the situation more clearly than many adults. "Where did you learn this?" she asked softly. "From simulators, from manuals, from studying all my life," he said. "I know I'm a kid, but I can help him understand what's happening. I don't need to fly the plane alone. I just need to be there to see the controls and tell him what I notice." She hesitated only a moment longer. Something in the boy's eyes convinced her. Not arrogance, not adventure, just sincerity and a sense of duty. She leaned closer and whispered, "Wait here." She walked quickly toward the cockpit. The boy felt his heart beating louder than the engines. Passengers were still panicking, but his world had shrunk down to a single point, the door at the front of the aircraft. 2 minutes later, the attendant returned. Her face had changed. She looked serious, almost shocked. She nodded to him slowly. "The first officer wants to see you." The boy froze. This was real. This was happening. His mother hugged him quickly. She whispered, "Go. Do what you believe is right." With trembling hands but steady steps, the boy began walking toward the cockpit. Every passenger watched silently as he passed, not knowing that the smallest person on the plane was about to take on the biggest responsibility of his life. The closer the boy walked to the cockpit, the louder the world around him seemed to become. Not because people were shouting, most were silent now, but because fear had a sound of its own. The soft crying of a baby, the nervous tapping of someone's foot, the rustle of a jacket as a man crossed his arms tightly. All those sounds blended into a heavy tension that filled the cabin. Yet the boy kept walking, step by step, with a strange calm settling inside him. He wasn't brave by nature, and he wasn't fearless. But something inside him knew that the plane needed someone who could see things differently, someone who had spent years watching and learning even when no one thought it mattered. When he reached the cockpit door, the attendant gently opened it. The boy stepped inside, and the door closed behind him. The cockpit was filled with blinking lights, warning messages, and the steady vibration of the engines. The first officer sat in his seat, his forehead wet with sweat, his hands tight on the controls. He looked exhausted, but when he turned to see the boy, his eyes softened, not with disbelief, but with hope he didn't know he needed. The boy quietly stepped forward. The first officer motioned him closer, pointing to the co-pilot's seat. "Sit there," he said, his voice tired but clear. "Tell me what you notice. Don't touch anything unless I tell you." The boy nodded quickly and slid into the seat, his small legs barely reaching the edge of the chair. The view outside took his breath away. Endless clouds stretched below them, but the aircraft wasn't flying straight. He could see it, slight drifting, gentle but dangerous. The instruments confirmed it, small but steady changes in pitch and yaw. The plane wasn't holding a stable path. The first officer explained quickly. "The captain lost consciousness. I'm trying to keep the aircraft stable, but one of our systems is glitching. The autopilot disconnects every few minutes, and we're losing balance." The boy looked at the displays, absorbing everything like a sponge. "Your trim reading is too high," he said softly. "It's overcompensating. That's why you're feeling the pull." The first officer looked at him sharply. He hadn't realized the trim imbalance yet, not in the chaos. The boy pointed toward the indicator. "It's not a big shift, but on long flights it matters." The officer adjusted the trim, and the plane steadied almost immediately. The sudden change made him stare at the boy with a new kind of respect. "Good catch," he said quietly. The boy felt a small wave of relief, but he knew this was only the beginning. Another warning flashed on the screen, a small indicator blinking amber. The officer muttered, "This again." The boy leaned in. "You have a fuel imbalance too," he said. "Tank 2 is burning faster." The officer checked. The boy was right again. "How do you know all this?" the officer asked. The boy shrugged slightly. "I study. I use flight simulators. I love planes more than anything. I learned everything I could." The officer almost smiled, but the situation kept the moment brief. "Okay," he said. "Then stay with me. I need your eyes on the instruments." The boy nodded, feeling a mix of pride and pressure. He didn't want to fail. Not now. Not when 236 lives were depending on the comm inside this small room. For several minutes, they worked quietly. The officer made adjustments, while the boy monitored readings, pointing out small irregularities or confirming stable numbers. The cabin outside couldn't hear any of this, but the energy in the cockpit was changing. The plane was stabilizing, slowly, carefully, but it was stabilizing. Then a softer alarm chimed. The officer checked the system. "We may need to descend soon," he said. "Weather ahead is heavier than expected." The boy studied the radar. "There's a clear path slightly left," he said. "If we turn a bit, we can avoid most of it." The officer switched the display. Again, the boy was right. "You've got an amazing eye," the officer said. It wasn't praise, it was acknowledgement. But before relief could settle, a cabin call came through. A crew member sounded worried. "Passengers are panicking. They heard the alarms. They want updates." The officer closed his eyes for a second. "I'll talk to them. But first," he looked at the boy. "Can you stay here with me until we land?" The boy froze. He hadn't thought that far. Helping stabilize was one thing. Landing the aircraft was something far bigger. But when he looked at the nervous lines on the officer's face, he realized the truth. The officer didn't want a child to fly the plane. He just needed a steady partner. A second pair of eyes, a calm mind, someone who could notice things he might miss while handling everything else. "Yes," the boy whispered. "I'll stay." The officer nodded with relief. He opened the intercom to speak to the cabin, but before he did, he looked at the boy again. "You're the reason we're still flying smoothly," he said. "I need you to stay focused." The boy nodded, feeling something warm grow inside him. Responsibility, courage, and maybe even destiny. Outside the cockpit, people only knew the situation was serious. They didn't know that the smallest person on board was the reason the plane had stopped drifting. And they didn't know how much more the boy was about to do. The first officer gave a short announcement to calm the passengers, but his voice still carried a strain that only those paying close attention could hear. He spoke carefully, assuring everyone that the flight crew was aware of the situation and handling it. But he didn't mention the boy sitting beside him, quietly watching every gauge, every number, every small change in the aircraft's behavior. When the announcement ended, the cockpit became silent again except for the steady hum of the engines and the soft clicking of switches. The boy kept his eyes on the instrument panel. For the first time since he stepped inside, the aircraft felt somewhat in control. But he also sensed that the real challenge had not yet arrived. Stabilizing the plane was one thing. Guiding it through the remaining hours and landing was another. The officer wiped his forehead with the back of his hand. His movements were slower now, heavy with fatigue. The boy noticed it immediately. "Are you okay?" he asked softly. The officer nodded, but the boy knew it wasn't a complete answer. Flying alone, managing alarms, communicating with ground control, and handling an unconscious captain had drained him. The boy realized something. Even if the officer was skilled, no one could handle this kind of strain for too long without help. A message suddenly appeared on the screen from air traffic control. The officer read it with tight lips. "They want us to divert," he said. "The weather ahead is worsening fast. If we continue on the current path, we'll hit turbulence stronger than expected." The boy studied the weather radar again. A large area of thick clouds and storm patches stretched across their route like a wall. The safer corridor he had spotted earlier was closing quickly as the storm drifted. They had to make a decision. The officer turned to him. "Do you see any safer pockets?" The boy hesitated, scanning the map carefully. "There's a narrow path on the right, but it's moving. If we turn now and hold a steady speed, we might get through before it closes." The officer checked again, comparing it with updated coordinates. "It's risky," he said. The boy took a breath. "It's less risky than flying straight into the main storm." The officer nodded slowly. In his exhaustion, he had started missing small details. Details the boy was still sharp enough to catch. "All right," he said. "We turn." He made the adjustment, and the aircraft began a gentle but noticeable shift. The cabin lights flickered slightly as the plane reoriented. Passengers felt the change and murmurs rose again, but the boy stayed focused on the radar, monitoring the gap they were aiming for. Minutes felt like hours. The clouds thickened around them, dark and heavy. The turbulence grew a little stronger, but the boy guided the officer on small corrections. A little more right. Hold that. Keep the altitude steady. The officer followed, trusting the child's instincts as much as the instruments. Finally, after several tense minutes, the shaking softened. The sky outside grew lighter. They were past the rough pocket. The officer exhaled, a long breath he had been holding unknowingly. "Good work," he said, not to himself, to the boy. But there was no time to relax. Another alert signal blinked, this time less urgent but still concerning. Fuel consumption on one side was dropping faster. The officer frowned. "This again." The boy checked the readings. "It's still imbalanced," he said. "You might need to cross-feed from the other tank for a while." The officer opened the fuel management controls, adjusting carefully. "You really know this aircraft," he said, almost as if he was trying to understand the boy's mind. The boy released a shy breath. "I just study because I love it." The officer gave a tired smile. "Today, your love for flying is saving us." A sudden knock on the cockpit door interrupted the moment. The attendant entered with a soft voice, holding 2 bottles of water and an oxygen mask. "He needs this," she said to the officer, pointing to the mask. "You've been breathing heavily." The boy realized she wasn't exaggerating. The officer's breathing had become strained. His chest rose and fell harder than before. He took the mask and secured it, inhaling deeply. The attendant then turned to the boy. "Passengers keep asking what's happening," she whispered. "I can't tell them everything, but they're sensing how serious it is." The officer looked at her. "Tell them we're stabilizing. Don't mention anything unusual." He glanced at the boy gently, making sure she understood. She nodded. She would protect the secret for now. When she left, the boy checked the clock. They were still far from the nearest airport. The officer leaned back for a brief moment, closing his eyes. "You need rest," the boy said cautiously. "I can't rest," the officer replied. "Not yet." The boy didn't push. He knew the officer was right, but he also knew the officer was reaching his limit. And if anything else went wrong, the burden would shift heavily onto him. A boy who had never touched real aircraft controls before today. The thought made his heart pound. He wasn't terrified of flying the plane. He was terrified of failing the people behind the door. Terrified that passion alone might not be enough. But something deep inside him kept repeating, "You are here for a reason." As the aircraft continued through calmer skies, the boy sensed that another challenge was coming, something bigger than they had faced so far. And when it arrived, he would have to be ready. The sky outside looked calmer, but inside the cockpit, the pressure kept growing. The officer had regained some strength after using the oxygen mask, yet his hands still trembled slightly. The boy noticed every small detail, the officer's tired eyes, the slow responses, the way he stretched his fingers as if fighting stiffness. These were not good signs for someone who still had to fly and land a passenger jet. The boy kept watching the altitude and fuel readings, making sure nothing slipped past them. He didn't want to admit it, even to himself, but he knew the officer might not be able to finish this flight alone. That thought scared him more than anything else. A soft vibration ran through the plane again. Not turbulence, something different. The boy checked the indicators. A small electrical warning blinked for a moment and disappeared, almost too fast to catch. But he had seen it. "We have a minor electrical fluctuation," he said quietly. The officer frowned. "Where?" The boy pointed. "Here. That light just flashed once. Maybe nothing, but we should keep an eye on it." The officer nodded. He looked at the boy for a second longer than before, as if silently acknowledging how much he depended on him now. "Good catch," he said again. Then another notification appeared, this time a message from air traffic control. The officer read it aloud. "Nearest airport ready for emergency landing." They're preparing the runway. The boy's stomach tightened. Emergency landing sounded much heavier when you were sitting inside the cockpit of a real plane instead of playing in a simulator. But he didn't let the fear take over. He straightened in his seat and focused. The officer took a breath. "We'll have to begin descent soon." The boy looked at him. "Do you feel strong enough?" The officer didn't answer right away. He adjusted a switch, then pressed his hand against his temple. He finally said, "I'll try, but I need you to keep checking everything. I can't afford to miss a single number." The boy nodded. "I won't let you." The officer began guiding the aircraft into a slow, controlled descent. The engines shifted pitch, and the nose dipped slightly. The passengers sensed the change and murmurs rose again outside the cockpit. But the boy stayed calm, reading out altitude and speed markers like he had practiced 1,000 times at home. For a few minutes, everything went smoothly. Then something unexpected happened. The officer's breathing grew heavier again. His hands trembled more than before. He blinked slowly, as if struggling to focus on the displays. He tried to tighten his grip on the controls, but the weakness in his arm was clear. The boy's heart jumped. "Are you okay?" he asked. The officer didn't respond immediately. He pressed the oxygen mask against his face again, taking fast breaths. "I'm okay," he said, but his voice was strained, thinner than before. The boy knew okay wasn't really okay. The officer removed the mask and tried adjusting the descent angle, but his arm shook so much that the nose dipped slightly too far. The boy reacted quickly. "Altitude dropping faster," he said. "Bring it up a little." The officer tried, but his hand slipped. The plane shook slightly as the controls jerked. "Hold the column," the officer said suddenly, his voice cracking. "Just hold it steady for a second." The boy froze. His small hands hovered above the control wheel, unsure. "I can't feel my arm properly," the officer whispered. "Just hold it. I'll guide you." The boy's breath caught in his throat. This was no longer about advising or reading instruments. This was touching the real controls of a real jet with hundreds of people behind him. But he placed his hands on the control wheel. His fingers shook, but he gripped firmly, just enough to hold it in place. "Good," the officer said, trying to stabilize with his other hand. "Don't move it. Just keep it steady while I adjust the systems." The boy nodded, focusing so hard it felt like his entire world narrowed to the control wheel in front of him. The plane steadied. Minutes passed, though they felt like hours. Finally, the officer managed to stabilize the descent again. "You can let go now," he said quietly. The boy released the controls slowly, but his heart kept racing. He looked at the officer, whose face was now pale, almost gray around the edges. "You need help," the boy whispered. "You can't do this alone." The officer leaned back, exhausted. "I know. That's why I need you with me. All the way." The boy felt the weight of those words sink deep inside him. All the way. That meant the approach. That meant the descent. That meant the landing. He swallowed hard. His hands were cold, but his voice stayed steady. "I'll help. Tell me what to do." The officer nodded slowly, trusting him more than ever. "You're not flying alone. I'll give every instruction. But you might have to handle part of the landing if my strength drops again." The boy felt his heart thump once, hard. The biggest part of the journey was still ahead. Outside the cockpit, the passengers had no idea that an 11-year-old was now a crucial part of keeping them safe. Inside the cockpit, the boy realized something life-changing. This wasn't just about knowledge anymore. This was about courage. The descent continued gently, but every minute inside the cockpit felt heavier than the last. The officer tried to stay focused, but his eyelids dropped lower each time he blinked. The boy watched him closely, noticing each small sign. The slow blinking, the tight jaw, the way his fingers slipped slightly off the switches. The officer wasn't just tired. He was fading. The boy checked the window. They were far below cloud level now. A pale stretch of land appeared in the distance. The emergency runway air traffic control had prepared for them. But the airport was still minutes away, and the final approach was the hardest part of any landing. The officer took another breath through the mask, then said quietly, "We need to prepare the aircraft for landing. Start with the approach checklist." The boy nodded immediately. His hands moved across the panel, not touching, only pointing and reading. Altitude set, speed within descent range. Flaps not yet deployed. Landing gear still locked, he said softly. The officer confirmed each item, his voice slower than before. Good. Good. Keep going. The boy kept reading the checklist, steady and calm, like someone far older. He didn't want the officer to sense how scared he was inside. He needed to be the stable one now. Another slight tremor ran through the plane. Not dangerous, just a reminder that the wind was still unsettled. The officer adjusted the controls, but his arm shook again. The boy felt a wave of worry. He didn't say anything, but the officer must have sensed it. "You're doing great," the officer whispered. "Better than some trainees I've worked with." The boy didn't know if that was true, but hearing it made something inside him settle. The runway grew clearer in the distance. The boy recognized the shape of the approach lights. This was becoming real, too real. His palms grew sweatier as the aircraft lowered. Suddenly, the electrical light the boy had seen earlier flickered again. Twice this time. The boy sat up straighter. "Electrical warning flashed," he said firmly. "It's still unstable." The officer checked quickly. "We might lose some assistance systems," he said. "But it's manageable." The boy nodded, but he also understood what that meant. Some automated landing support might not work. The officer would be handling more manually, and he was barely holding on. The cockpit phone rang again. The attendant spoke with a trembling tone. "Passengers are crying. Some are saying goodbye to each other. Can we tell them something?" The officer looked at the boy, then back at the door. "Tell them we're lined up for landing. And tell them we're doing everything possible." The attendant nodded and left. The officer returned his focus to the controls, but the boy could see the struggle in his face. His breathing grew uneven again. He reached for the throttle, but his hand slipped weakly. The boy reacted immediately. "I'll hold it," he said softly. "Just tell me the position." The officer hesitated. Letting a child touch the throttle was something no pilot ever imagined, but he didn't have strength left to argue. He guided the boy with slow instructions, and the boy moved the throttle just enough to maintain the correct speed. The aircraft steadied again. "You're doing perfect," the officer said. "Just keep listening." The boy nodded, but his heart pounded so loudly he could hear it in his ears. They drew closer. The ground grew clearer. The airport buildings, the emergency vehicles lining the sides, waiting with silent hope. "Flaps to the first step," the officer said. The boy responded exactly as instructed. The plane dipped slightly, lowering gently into position. The officer blinked harder this time. His voice grew thin. "If my arm stops working again, I'll need you to help hold the control wheel at landing." The boy's breath caught in his throat. I'll try." "You won't try," the officer said quietly. "You'll do it. I believe in you." The boy swallowed hard. His legs felt like stone. His hands tingled, but his eyes stayed fixed on the runway ahead. The officer prepared the last steps. "Landing gear," he said. The boy flipped the switch on command. A soft thud vibrated through the plane as the wheels locked into place. The officer reached for the control wheel with both hands, one barely cooperating, the other trembling. The boy placed his hands lightly beside his, ready to support if needed. The runway lights aligned perfectly now. They were seconds away. "Listen to me," the officer said slowly. "I will lower us. You will help me keep us straight. Don't fight the wheel. Just follow my hands." The boy nodded, his heartbeat almost painful in his chest. The plane dipped lower, wind brushing the windows. The cabin behind them grew completely silent. Not a cry, not a whisper. Everyone held their breath. The officer pulled the wheel gently, then his weak arm slipped again. The boy reacted, placing both hands firmly on the wheel to keep it steady. The officer guided him with his remaining strength. Good, hold it. Don't let it tilt." The runway raced toward them. The boy held the wheel with every bit of steadiness he had. The officer whispered, "We're landing. Stay with me." And the wheels touched down. A small bounce. Then another. The boy tightened just enough, and the aircraft remained level. They were almost there. Almost. The aircraft rolled forward, its wheels shaking against the runway as the boy and the officer held the controls together. The boy's arms trembled, not because he was weak, but because the responsibility felt heavier than anything he had ever imagined. The officer guided him with soft, tired words, barely able to keep his own hand steady. Hold it straight. We're almost there." The plane slowed, the engines roaring as the officer applied reverse thrust. The boy watched the speed drop steadily. 140, 120, 100. The runway stretched ahead, lined with emergency vehicles and flashing lights. But the boy stayed focused only on the numbers and the feel of the controls beneath his hands. "Good job. Keep it centered," the officer whispered, his voice almost fading. The aircraft rolled slower, until finally it came to a full stop. Silence filled the cockpit. The officer leaned back, completely drained. The boy kept his hands on the controls for a moment longer, afraid that letting go too soon would break some invisible balance. Then he slowly released the wheel and exhaled shakily, feeling his heartbeat echo in his ears. "We did it," he whispered. The officer looked at him, eyes glossy with exhaustion and gratitude. "No," he said softly. "You did it." The boy didn't know what to say. His hands still shook. His breath still felt uneven. He had never been more scared in his life, but he had also never felt more alive. A sudden knock on the cockpit door startled them both. The attendant entered, tears in her eyes. Are we safe?" she asked. The officer nodded. "Yes, we're safe." She exhaled in relief and covered her face for a moment. Then she looked at the boy, her expression shifting from confusion to disbelief as she realized the truth. "Was he helping you?" The officer nodded again. "He didn't just help. I couldn't have done it without him." The attendant stared at the boy, her eyes filling again. Not with fear now, but with awe. "Everyone needs to know," she whispered. "No," the officer said gently. "Not yet. Let the passengers off calmly first." The boy followed the attendant out of the cockpit. When the door opened, dozens of anxious faces turned toward him. At first, no one understood why a child was stepping out of the cockpit. They expected the captain or the first officer or someone who fit the usual image of a pilot. But instead, it was him, small, nervous, eyes red from strain. He froze in the doorway. The entire cabin stared in silence. Then one voice from the back gasped, "He came out of the cockpit?" Another whispered, "Was that boy helping them?" A ripple spread through the passengers, confusion mixing with shock. The boy lowered his gaze, embarrassed by the attention. He wanted to hide, to disappear into the seats. But then something unexpected happened. A woman in the front row stood up. Her hands trembled, but she offered him the warmest smile he had ever seen. "Thank you," she said softly. The boy blinked, unsure if she was talking to him. Another passenger stood. "You saved us," the man said. Then a father with a toddler added, "We owe you our lives." Row by row, people rose to their feet. The entire cabin stood, 236 passengers, looking at the 11-year-old who had helped keep the plane in the sky. Applause broke out, not loud at first, but steady, building, filling every corner of the aircraft. People clapped with relief, gratitude, and disbelief. The boy's eyes filled with tears. He had never imagined this moment, not in his wildest dreams. His mother rushed forward, pulling him into a tight hug. Her voice shook. "You were so brave. I'm so proud of you." The boy hugged her back, finally letting himself feel everything he had held inside during the flight. The fear, the pressure, the hope, the responsibility. He pressed his face into her shoulder, overwhelmed. When emergency staff boarded the plane, they were prepared for chaos. But instead they found passengers cheering and pointing toward an 11-year-old boy standing near the cockpit door. Paramedics hurried to the officer and the unconscious captain. while the head of airport operations approached the boy carefully. "Son," he said kindly, "we've heard what you did. You helped save this entire flight." The boy shook his head. "I didn't do it alone. The officer, he guided me." The officer, now seated and receiving medical care, raised his hand weakly. "He's being modest," he said. "This young man was my co-pilot today." Those words sank into everyone around them. Co-pilot. At 11 years old, the airport official knelt to the boy's height. "You showed courage, calmness, and a heart stronger than many adults. This world needs people like you." The boy looked at the runway lights outside. They didn't feel distant now. They felt like part of his story, maybe even part of his future. As he stepped off the plane, dozens of passengers thanked him personally, some shaking his hand, some touching his shoulder, some simply smiling through tears. He didn't know what to say to most of them. He only knew that he had done what he believed was right. And in doing so, he had discovered something about himself that he would remember for the rest of his life. Courage doesn't wait for age. It waits for a moment. And when that moment comes, even an 11-year-old can change the fate of 236 people.